Welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Chapter 15 to analyze the architecture of a true market giant, the monopoly. We're going to break down exactly how they're born, the mechanics of how they operate, and their massive impact on our society. It's a really fascinating look into how market power is consolidated and ultimately maintained.
Here is our roadmap for today. We'll track the life cycle of these giants across 5 distinct phases: the birth of a monopoly, the monopolist's playbook, the cost to society, the price discrimination puzzle, and finally, taming the market giants.
But before we get into the mechanics, we really have to set a clear parameter. What exactly makes a giant? You see, a monopoly isn't just a big, highly successful company. In economic terms, it's a firm that is the absolute sole seller in a market, standing completely alone without any close substitutes for what it offers. If consumers can't easily switch to something similar when you decide to hike up your prices, well, you're holding the monopoly cards. Let's initialize Phase 1, the birth of a monopoly. A monopoly survives and thrives because of something called barriers to entry. Basically, this is what stops other ambitious companies from jumping into the ring to compete. And these barriers essentially come from 3 main sources. First, hoarding monopoly resources, meaning a single firm owns a crucial input required to make the product. Second, government regulation, where the government literally grants one firm the exclusive right to produce a good. Think about patents on life-saving pharmaceuticals or copyrights on books. And third, the production process itself, where a single firm can just produce output at a much lower cost than a bunch of smaller firms ever could. To really picture this, consider the classic water well analogy. Imagine you live in a small, isolated town, and you happen to be the only person who owns a working well. It's impossible for anyone to get water anywhere else. Because water is an absolute necessity, and you hold the exclusive resource, you completely dictate that market. You can command quite a high price, even if pumping out that extra gallon of water costs you next to nothing. Your market power is pretty much absolute. Now, sometimes the scope of the market naturally favors one massive giant. Economists call this a natural monopoly. This happens when a single firm's average total cost just continually declines as they produce more and more. What that means is one giant firm can supply a good or service to an entire market at a way lower cost than 2 or 3 smaller firms could. If you tried to divide production up among more competitors, each firm would produce less, and their average cost would actually go up. Moving into Phase 2, the monopolist's playbook. Let's decode how this singular entity actually sets its prices to maximize profit. The key difference here is all about market power. A normal competitive firm is what we call a price taker. It can sell all it wants, but it has to just accept the prevailing market price. Our monopolist, on the other hand, is a price maker. Since it's the sole producer, it faces the entire downward-sloping market demand curve all by itself. If the monopolist wants to sell more units, it is forced to drop the price. It can pick any point on that demand curve, but it absolutely cannot defy it. Let's bring back our small-town water well to see how these numbers actually play out. To sell the very first gallon, say the price is $10. Your total revenue is $10. Simple. But to convince someone to buy a second gallon, you have to lower the price to $9. This means your total revenue becomes $18. So the marginal revenue, the extra cash brought in by that second gallon, is only $8. Do you see what's happening? The marginal revenue is actually less than the price of the good itself. And that leads us to the absolute golden rule for a market giant. A monopoly's marginal revenue will always be less than the price it charges. Why? Because of the price effect. When a monopoly increases production by 1 unit, it literally has to reduce the price it charges for every single unit it sells. That price cut eats right into the revenue of the units it was already selling. It's a fundamental trade-off. So a monopoly maximizes profit by producing exactly the quantity where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. But because they set the rules, the final price you pay is always greater than that marginal cost. That's the real power of the playbook. Phase 3. The cost to society. What does this massive entity actually cost the rest of us? This is a really fascinating way to think about it, because a monopoly flexes its market power by charging a price that's above the marginal cost of production. It creates a wedge. Now, a government tax also creates a wedge between what consumers pay and producers get, but the government uses that revenue. A monopolist is essentially acting as a private tax collector, gathering up all that surplus entirely for its own profit. But the real tragedy here for society is something economists call deadweight loss. The main inefficiency of a monopoly isn't actually just the uncomfortably high price tag. The real problem is that the giant purposefully produces less output than society actually needs.
They artificially restrict the quantity to keep prices sky high, which means consumers who value the good more than it costs to produce get priced right out of the market. The overall economic pie literally shrinks.
Booting up Phase 4, the price discrimination puzzle. Let's explore a very clever adaptation in the Giants playbook that tries to capture even more of that shrinking economic pie.
Let's connect this directly to your own life. Think about the last time you took a flight. Have you ever wondered why you and the person sitting right next to you in the exact same row, going to the exact same place, can pay drastically different amounts for the journey?
It can be so incredibly frustrating, right? But this perfectly captures the economic reality of our modern markets. Companies leverage their market power to figure out exactly what you, as an individual, are willing to pay, and they charge you that specific amount, while charging your seatmate something entirely different. This is the textbook definition of price discrimination, and for a profit-maximizing monopolist, it's a completely rational strategy. But here's the catch. To actually pull this off, the firm has to have market power, and it must be able to cleanly separate its customers. They might slice us up geographically, by our age bracket, or by our income, all just to pinpoint exactly how much we value their product.
But there's a massive glitch in this pricing matrix, and it's called arbitrage. Arbitrage is basically buying a good in one market for a low price and immediately flipping it in another market at a higher price. If people can easily buy the cheap version of a good and resell it to the high-paying customers, the entire price discrimination scheme just collapses. That's exactly why you can't typically resell a personalized airline ticket to someone else.
Finally, we reach Phase 5, taming the market giants. How exactly does society respond to all these inefficiencies?
Historically, how has society fought back? Well, the government gets its power to fight monopolies from a series of antitrust laws aimed at preserving free competition. This whole push started back in 1890 with the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was designed to curb the massive dominant trusts of that era. Then the Clayton Antitrust Act of 1914 strengthened those powers. And today, those very same foundational laws are right at the center of the fierce debates over mega-mergers in industries like airlines and banking.
Now, we have to look at this impartially, because it's a really delicate balancing act for policymakers. While implementing antitrust laws and breaking up giants clearly promotes competition, it can also have unintended costs. You see, sometimes companies merge not to squash the competition, but to lower their costs through more efficient joint production, what we call synergies. For example, if two banks merge, they might be able to drastically reduce their administrative overhead. Blocking that merger means blocking those real cost savings.
So, what's on the menu for policymakers dealing with a market giant? They essentially have four options. First, use antitrust laws to actively break up the firm or block mergers. Second, step in and heavily regulate the actual prices the monopoly is allowed to charge. Third, take over and turn the private monopoly into a government-run public enterprise. Or fourth, and this happens more than you'd think, if they believe the market failure is actually pretty small compared to the inevitable messiness of government intervention, they can simply do nothing at all.
I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative thought to chew on. We've traced the life cycle of a monopoly, from those initial barriers to entry all the way to the public pushback. But looking out at our modern landscape, are antitrust laws written for 1890s railroads really equipped to govern the massive, data-driven tech empires that we completely rely on right now? Thank you so much for exploring market giants with me today. See you on the next explainer.